Hi everyone, it's Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH1002, and this is the ninth video summary of the topics we'll be covering in Lecture 9 for social media innovation. What we're going to look at this week is we're talking about electronic music sharing. We're talking about the idea that music is a social experience. And that social experience is culturally defined, and it's something that we've done for many thousands of years as a species, and it seems to be common amongst most expressions of our cultural activity wherever humans gather. Music seems to be an integral part of our social experience. It's part of the way that we communicate and that we go beyond, if you like, formalised language, and we express something which is more than just kind of a sense of expedient information management, but it's about joyfulness and it's about communion and pleasure, and takes us into a more contemplative state, if you like. That's the power that music has for us. But we also are starting to think about this in terms of the way that this is migrated into an electronic, network-based, internet-based kind of system. So last week we looked at the idea of kind of electronic music sharing and how kind of patterns of behaviour through the use of electronic techniques for sharing and exchanging music have changed the way that we think about music more recently, and how that's kind of we're being redefined in that way. So this week what I want to do is I want to look at kind of some of the, if you like, the background information which kind of drives this more contemporary focus on information exchange, which is the data analytics approach, which is the kind of looking at media as a product which is circulated in a network system as information rather than necessarily as a cultural experience. So it's almost, the kind of the programmers, the systems engineers have taken over the responsibility for helping us to share and facilitate musical experience rather than our interests and our kind of our imaginations, so if that makes sense. So there's a kind of there's a set of metrics that are often used in kind of marketing of music and kind of planning for the sharing of music online, which looks at things like there's a list of phrases like it's conversation buzz, conversation value, the volume of a conversation, the people who are involved in that conversation, the types of people, the demography of those people, what levels of influence those people have at different points in the process of sharing and exchanging information. Where does the message that artists who create music, where does that flow to? Where does that reach? How is that? What does it embody in terms of sentiment, mood, something to identify with, and kind of give voice to a cultural expression? So there's a range of kind of organising principles that can be identified with the way that we share music, and we use data analytics in order to be able to understand that. Now, it doesn't mean to say that the music's any good. It means that we know and we can count how often it's shared, how often it's downloaded, how often it's listened to. But it doesn't mean to say if it kind of has a cultural and lasting expression of change or identification. It doesn't create a sense of belonging. So we're in a different environment, which kind of means that we have to change and rethink through how we share our cultural experience. So some of the things that we'll look at is the kind of how much emphasis you have on your influence if you share and champion particular kinds of artists and music, and how much of that kind of goes outside of your peer group, if you like, your networks of interest, how much of that goes beyond into other networks of interests. So we can look at this in quite a practical way. What kind of tips would you give people for sharing music? What kind of tips have people been given in terms of how to create a sense of community and identity around a musical, a performer, an artist, a band, a culture, a kind of a cultural movement? And then which platform would you experience would you put that out on? Which is the best kind of platform? YouTube, Spotify, Tumblr. There's kind of a myriad of platforms out there that come and go sometimes. And what's the best way to get people to exchange and share that information? At the end of the day, I suppose there's a couple of factors which are really important, and one is it's about the content. If the content is second rate and forgettable and doesn't chime with people's understanding of what is music, then it kind of it limits how it can spread, I suppose. So it's about the engagement that some music has, and it might not be immediate. It might be something that we look back on in years to come and say, actually, that was radical and groundbreaking, but it took us a long time to drop our present conformities and accept a new sense of something, something that comes out of a new musical form, if you like, which kind of might be avant-garde to begin with, but which is something which is kind of becomes the norm. And think about things like, I think a good example of that is, look at the Star Wars music that John Williams produced. It's essentially based on modernist music written in the early part of the 20th century. He's a great magpie, John Williams, of taking themes. So he's kind of Stravinsky and Holst and Bruckner and lots of the kind of what were once considered as kind of avant-garde composers who challenged the mainstream idea of what music was about, which was alien to audiences for symphonic music in the first part of the 20th century, but which has subsequently become the norm in terms of filmmaking and kind of film music, and it's kind of the readaptation of it. So these things can take time for them to become embedded. So the argument about kind of the music metrics, to go back to the topic of the lecture, is the idea that, kind of we shouldn't be afraid of the data. We shouldn't be afraid of the information because it tells us something about who is listening. And it's this idea that it becomes, kind of music and performance becomes, and the music business has actually become a data management business. It's about knowing who your fans are, where they are, and giving your fans what they want. So a classic example is Morrissey, ex-lead singer of the Smiths, massive in Mexico, has a big fan base in Mexico, and performs and plays there on a regular basis. And it's kind of what is a guy brought up in Manchester, kind of singing and kind of about the gloomy days of living in the north of England. What's that got to do with Mexicans? And this kind of, so this kind of intercultural exchange has taken place. And without being able to trace and track, and social media gives us that potential. Now, it's a dangerous tool to just give people what they want, because the fans only kind of, the hardcore fans often just want you to repeat the hits and regurgitate the hits. They don't want you to break into new ground and try new things out. So it could be a straitjacket for innovation. So we have to be careful about how we use these things. So we'll look at some of these ideas. I've got some music videos to play through this. We've got some examples of some bands that over the last couple of years that I've kind of caught my attention. I'm feeling at the moment that there's not very much catching my attention at the moment. So if you've got any suggestions and ideas for music that you think I might be interested in, that has a kind of kind of is interesting in its own right, that is kind of breaking new ground, I'd be very interested if we shared that. Anyway, the notes are up on the DMU wiki, which is at wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. Just look for the TECH1002 section, and I'll see you at the lecture on Tuesday.